Good morning. This is our last lecture for Art History Survey 1. And as we come to the end of these lectures, I realize I could have said this in the beginning, but you could listen to these lectures in your car and just put it on audio and then go back and look at the PowerPoints, because the videos and the PowerPoints have the same material, which hopefully you've figured out by now. But anyway, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately and realize that may be my new future direction for teaching. Anyway, thinking about that technology gets me thinking about the shift in technology that we've seen from the prehistoric caves to the beautiful Gothic cathedrals that we saw in the last lecture. And how many of you took note of the fact that we started in France? We started in Lascaux, and with the prehistoric art of cave painting and those beautiful bowls that we saw molded onto the floor, just scooped out of that clay, just that raw clay, and the imprints of those hands just left there like that for thousands of years. And that was in France. And now we're back in France again with human hands building these cathedrals, creating these jam statues, the statues at Chartres, the statues at Rheims, this portal sculpture that we saw in the Romanesque church at Autun, Saint-Lazare. So it's kind of a full circle sort of thing. And to me, it speaks of the human condition, that there is this desire to create, to reach for something else, whatever that may be, something from deep within the human psyche, something that is greater than the human psyche, to give it form, to give it voice. And we're paving the way now, and hopefully some of you are interested or get opportunity to take Survey 2. And in Survey 2, of course, we begin with the Renaissance. And this last lecture really has artwork that is precursor to that Renaissance. We go into a little bit of the international style, sort of a potpourri, if you will. And we'll be looking at Italian art and art from France, and also in the northern climates. So the age of the cathedrals ends. It was such a short time that they were building these cathedrals. And in the late 13th century, all of a sudden we have this huge overpopulation and decline, which sometimes can happen. All of the people coming to the cities start beginning to congregate, and all of a sudden there isn't enough of everything. And then this is followed by the 100 Years' War. We talked about that a little bit last time, and the plague, of course, which decimated the entire population of Europe. Just imagine losing 40% of all of the human beings in Europe. So, for obvious reasons, this large construction ceases. But we do see the Gothic style continuing in smaller churches, different municipal buildings, private residencies. So, if you want to study into that further, you can find all sorts of things online about that. And we do begin to see it migrating north in the Holy Roman Empire, in Germany, in England. It's a little bit later, takes a little bit different form. And so that's what we're going to look at today. So I'm going to start by showing you this independent sculpture from France. This is a Virgin and Child. It's a gilt sculpture from the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis. And I'm showing you this first to sort of give you a little bit of a continuation from those portal sculptures at Rheims. So if you remember, we talked about that S-curve, a little bit of the classicizing influence, the treatment of the drapery, the beautiful face of the Virgin, the beautiful face of the Christ child. He still is not proportioned like an actual baby. You can notice the head is very small, but he does have some features of an infant. So it's a little bit closer to actual infancy than earlier representations. If you think back to that wooden Madonna and Christ, for instance, where he really was like a miniature grown man. So this sculpture is 2 feet tall. It's made out of silver gilt enamel, beautiful enamel around the base, very simple, and it's foreshadowing later 14th century representations. And I'm going to be referencing back to this sculpture when we look, for example, at the work of Duccio in Italy. There's a strong market now for objects taken from popular literature. And this is, yes, the age of chivalry with knights of shining armor, maidens, jousts, maidens locked in the tall castle. So decorated jewel boxes, combs, mirror cases, things like that. And so we see on the surface of this one, 2 jousting knights. And notice the stubby figures. That's very similar even to Ottonian influences that we see here. Book arts at this time are including lodge books, which are visual instruction, things like that. We have apprentices. We have this commercial guild growing up. We have, actual workshops for different things. So people are starting to write books of instructions for practical manuals, also devotional works, ways to live your life, things like that. This particular book is from what's called the Moralized Bible, which is really a way of codifying these selections from the Old and the New Testaments that we've been looking at all along. They're paired to give a moral interpretation. So we have Queen Blanche of Castile on the left, who is Louis's mother, with the teenage king, Louis. So it's gold background, beautiful color, all derived from stained glass windows. It's actually attached to the vellum and polished with a burnisher, and then it's painted right on top of the gold. And so we have underneath at the bottom the scribe and the scholar below giving sort of writing this book and giving it to Blanche and Louis. You can see the architecture around it is inspired by Ottonian manuscripts. So this morphs into what we call the court style. And if you notice the faces on these figures, again, I'll reference back to that sculpture of Mary and the Christ child that we looked at the beginning of this lecture. This is the Psalter of St. Louis, and it's defining this court style with manuscript illustration. Very stylized oak tree in the middle, but yet it's a nod to the natural, that they're actually the shapes of that particular type of oak tree in terms of the leaves. We have acorns, so it's a stylized as it is a move toward representation of the natural world, which is going to take its shape later in the end of the 14th century and fully into the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, in England, we have the Plantagenets ruling, and they rule until 1485. So that was sort of the end for now of what we're looking at from France. So the 13th century in England is characterized again by the beginning of this 100 Years' War. We have England fighting with France. So there isn't a lot of cultural interaction, if you will, other than, moving back and forth in various battles. And so in England, the Black Death is a little bit later. It strikes in the 14th century, so it moves outward. It's moving outward, up from Italy and then through into France and up into England, eventually throughout all of Europe. And so due to all of these factors, late medieval England, we really don't have large cities anymore. They've been decimated, for one thing. And so we've got rural villages, market towns, and London really is the large city, and it's dominating everything else. So for Gothic architecture in England, we're going to look at the Salisbury Cathedral, which is much lower, and I know it's hard to tell from a picture. what you really need to do is you can go online and do a little research, pull up the actual proportions of Salisbury, proportions of Chartres, Rheims, and Amiens, and then look at them side by side proportionally. And you'll be able to see this is much squatter. It's much wider. They're much more concerned with the longitudinal, with the, moving forward into the apse. And so it's wider. There's a tall spire, of course, but it's long, broad naves and passageways up at the clerestory level. So it's retaining this Romanesque solidity. And this is characteristic of English architecture in general. So it's really an ideal representation of the English Gothic, with all of the tracery on the outside. We have this solid wall of decorative tracery, blind niches, although we don't have the deep portals that we see in the French Gothic, but still the flavor is there, the pointed archways, the Gothic tracery, the decoration at the tops of the spires. It's holding a Gothic similarity, although the proportions are a little bit different. And of course, it's minus all that stained glass and the rose window. So here's the inside of it. Again, this Norman tradition that we saw back in Durham, very heavy walls, very tall arcade with simple lancet windows. So the emphasis, again, is on horizontal movement toward forward rather than upward. And again, the color is coming from the stonework, which again is reminiscent of these Romanesque interiors at Durham. The Gothic castle is again similar to the Romanesque castle, but a little bit more developed. So it's all encased inside one moat. There's a great hall at the end with one donjon keep. And this becomes a standardized way to create these castles. And it's because they're in a war that's lasting 100 years. So they need all of this protection. They need the moat. They need the portcullis bridge, these tall walls, thick walls that they can bring people in and protect them. Everything is self-contained. The chapel, the keep, the living quarters, places for workshops, all can be within this stockade. So in France, we have book production in scriptoria, as we saw with the Moralized Bible. And if I didn't say it, I'll just say it again here. One huge difference is that Moralized Bible was made in a commercial scriptorium, where up until the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, most of the books were done in monastery. But the scriptoria that the Moralized Bible that we looked at was done in is actually a commercial enterprise done for profit. Now in England, it's still done in rural monasteries for various reasons. At the end of the 13th century, we see a few more secular workshops. And one beautiful distinction of English manuscripts is these beautiful naturalistic works in the margins. So for most English manuscripts, you're going to see the text in the center the way this one is laid out, maybe with a small picture, but not taking up the full page. And we're going to see all of this beautiful vines or leaves all the way around the outside. The English are also famous for their embroidery. It's called opus Anglicanum, or this Latin for English work. The Pope in Rome had 100 pieces of this, and it's all embroidery. So this whole surface is just thousands and thousands of tiny little stitches of thread right to it. So it's not woven. It's a solid piece of material, and then they take a needle and thread and take all these different colors of thread to make these beautiful pictures on it. And so they have gold thread and silver thread and different colors of wool and silk and different materials. And this fabric, done in different thicknesses, was used for all sorts of different things, from draperies to vestments to secular uses for court dress. It was very, very well known, and they had a very thriving set of workshops in this technique. Now, in Germany, we have the Holy Roman Empire, which is really dissolving. We've talked about this a little bit already. So what's happening at this time in history is England and France are becoming very strong national states, albeit they're at war. Germany, however, is sort of devolving into this conglomeration, if you will, of a lot of different independent bishoprics, cities. And so the Holy Roman Empire, unlike the Attonian Empire, it's not a significant power anymore. It's not centralized. So the Holy Roman emperors, depending on where their state is, they're emperors of their own states. And their power, they're patrons of the arts. They don't wield political power. They're not going out with their armies and annexing, conquering large tracts of land. In Germany, Gothic architecture develops in what's called the hall church. There begins to be an emphasis on sermons in the 13th century, and you might say that this could be a forerunner or a precursor to the Reformation that happens in the 16th century in Germany with Martin Luther, although that is a couple hundred years away. And so we have a nave and side aisles, but the vaults are all the same height. So it's a large space meant to accommodate large crowds because there's these charismatic preachers that are starting to happen. And so they're drawing these large crowds and people are coming to listen to a specific person. So it's a little bit different emphasis than we have in England and France or even Italy, where the emphasis is on the liturgy rather than the words of a particular man. And part of this has to do with the fact that they're beginning to give sermons in the vernacular so people can understand what they're saying, which has a great impact on the religious worship of the time. So we also have a thriving Jewish community by this time in Germany. And this is the oldest functioning synagogue in Europe, and fairly certain that it is still functioning. And so you can really see here this idea of this Gothic hall church design. Although the bima, of course, is in the center, they're all the same size. They're all the same size, but we just have two aisles. If you notice from the drawing of the plan here, we just have two side aisles, two aisles with 3 bays each. So again, if you think back to the early Christian version of the synagogue that we were looking at, we just saw a little piece of it, but it's this idea that this is a place for communal learning is the way that they celebrate their tradition. And so the Aron is the shrine for all of the Torah scrolls. You can see the picture here. That's what we're looking at here. So the worshipers will face the Aron, which is located in the direction of Jerusalem on the east wall. Here's an example of the kind of sculpture that you would see in Germany at this time. This is a reliquary, and it was created for the Archbishop of Cologne for the relics of the 3 Magi. And it's actually done in the form of a basilica, straight basilica church design with no transept or spire. And it's evolving to accommodate changes in church architecture. So it's a really nice example of looking at the church architecture in this sculptural object. If you notice the fully modeled figures, the classicizing in the modeling of them, it's got a lot of Italian influence, a lot of influence from Roman sarcophagi and Roman sculpture. And so here is another example of sculpture by Nicholas of Verdun, and he inspired a tradition of classicizing style in architectural sculpture. So this one is from the South Transept in Strasbourg, which is variously claimed by France and Germany. And it's a combination of German expressionism along with classicizing style, which is really interesting to look at these two things together. If you notice the expressions on the faces of the angel, even the expression on the people cradling the Virgin, and here she is on her deathbed. Christ, of course, has received her soul, but even the Christ has emotion to him. So here are Eckhard and Uta in Naumberg, and the bishop of Wettin, Dietrich II, had life-size sculptures of all ancestors placed all around this chapter that he built. And this secured their perpetual attendance at Mass, which in turn, of course, secured the perpetual saving of their souls. And this is a precursor to the naturalism that we'll begin to see in German art from now onward, as well as this idea of expressionism. So expressionism doesn't necessarily have to mean deep sorrow or deep joy, although in German art it definitely takes that form, as we're going to see in one of the next images. But it also just has to do with depicting the everyday as it is, an expression of the daily life, an expression of actual people, which is very different than an idealized saint. So this Vesperbild is sort of an extreme example of this deep sorrow, this deep devotion. And remember, we're in an atmosphere where we've had famine, we've had war, we've had plague. We're in a world that is not promising any kind of hope for safety and security. We've been at war for 100 years with all of the ravages that entails. So there'll be sort of this dichotomy between this physical, deep physical suffering and then cloying sweetness, this thing to aspire to or to turn to or that we might hope for. So these are devotional images that are meant for meditation in the evening Vesperbild. And sometimes I like to even call this 14th century Northern, that this is a 14th century sculpture. And it's similar in size to the sculpture that we saw at the very beginning of this lecture, that beautiful gilt Virgin and Child sculpture. So two very different portrayals of Mary and the Christ. One with the mother with her new son before all of this happens, although of course there's a knowing within her that she's going to be giving this son up, they've told her. And then here, having made this sacrifice and the sorrow that entails. So we have this deep suffering, deep anguish. We have the rosettes at the bottom and the rosette on his body. Those are symbols of his wounds. You can see one on his foot and one on his hand. Okay. The last two sections, we will look at 13th and 14th century art in Italy briefly, and then one or two slides on the international style. So these last few slides that we're going to see are the bridge between the trajectory that we've seen up until now and the beginnings of the Italian and the Northern Renaissance.